They say mastery of a technique makes you dangerous, but mastery of one specific tuning makes you untouchable. Keith Richards built his entire sound on open G tuning, removing the low E string and creating a 5-string approach that defined the Rolling Stones rhythm and made Keith's riffs instantly recognizable to anyone who knew guitar. By 1967, Keith had been playing open G for years, had developed techniques and approaches that other guitarists couldn't replicate even when they tried the same tuning, had turned this alternate configuration into his signature and his fortress. When he heard about Jimi Hendrix impressing London guitarists with flashy techniques and effects, Keith's response was dismissive and territorial. "Electric tricks are one thing," Keith said, "but real guitar innovation comes from finding new ways to make the instrument speak, not from turning up the volume and adding distortion." "Try playing in open G," Keith told someone who would relay the message to Jimi. "That's where you separate the musicians from the performers." It was a challenge delivered with the arrogance of someone who owns a technique so completely that he can't imagine anyone else mastering it. But when Jimi Hendrix accepted that challenge on an autumn evening in 1967, what happened in the next hour didn't just surprise Keith Richards. It made him feel like he had been playing guitar wrong his entire life. And 50 years later, Keith still describes that evening as the moment he realized that some people don't just play instruments. They channel something that the rest of us can only witness and never fully understand. Autumn 1967. The Rolling Stones are at a creative peak, having moved beyond their blues covers phase into writing original material that captures something raw and dangerous about the cultural moment. Their album Between the Buttons has been released earlier in the year, and they're working on what will become their Satanic Majesty's Request, experimenting with psychedelic sounds and studio techniques that push beyond their rhythm and blues foundation. Keith Richards is 23 years old and has established himself as one of rock's most distinctive rhythm guitarists, not through technical virtuosity in the traditional sense, but through absolute mastery of open G tuning, creating riffs and rhythms that sound simple but that other guitarists can't quite replicate, because they require an understanding of how open G changes the relationship between strings and chords. Keith's playing is economical and precise, every note serving the song, nothing wasted. The 5-string approach creating a lean, aggressive sound that becomes the Stones' signature. Keith Richards' relationship with open G tuning is almost mystical in its intensity. He discovered the tuning through listening to old blues records, particularly those featuring slide guitar, where open tunings allowed players to create full chord sounds with the slide rather than having to fret individual notes. But Keith adapted open G for standard playing without a slide, using it to create rhythms and riffs that had a drive and momentum that standard tuning couldn't achieve. The removal of the low E string, which Keith considered unnecessary in open G, created a tighter, more focused sound, where every string had a clear purpose. By 1967, Keith has been playing exclusively in open G for several years, has developed muscle memory and finger patterns that are unique to this tuning, has created techniques that work only because of the specific intervals that open G provides. Other guitarists who try to copy Stones' songs in open G find that just tuning the guitar differently doesn't give them Keith's sound, that there's something about how he approaches the tuning that can't be learned just by mimicking the technical setup. When Jimi Hendrix arrives on the London scene in late 1966, Keith hears about him through the usual channels but doesn't pay much attention initially. The Rolling Stones are established stars, busy with their own projects, not particularly concerned with new arrivals who might or might not have staying power. But as Jimi's reputation grows through the first half of 1967, as more and more musicians start talking about this American guitarist who's doing things that don't seem possible, Keith starts hearing comparisons that irritate him. People are saying that Jimi is revolutionizing guitar, that he's showing new possibilities for the instrument, that he's making other guitarists rethink their approach. Keith's response, expressed in conversations with other musicians and in interviews, is skeptical. He says that a lot of what Jimi does relies on volume and effects, on technical tricks that are impressive but that don't necessarily represent deep understanding of the guitar as an instrument. Keith says that anyone can make noise with enough amplification, but creating a signature sound that's immediately recognizable, developing a technique that becomes your identity, that requires years of focused work within specific constraints. The specific challenge about open G tuning emerges from one of these conversations. Keith is at a gathering of musicians talking about guitar approaches and techniques, and someone mentions Jimi Hendrix's playing. Keith makes a dismissive comment about how Jimi plays in standard tuning, using standard techniques amplified by effects and volume. Someone else points out that Jimi actually uses various tunings and approaches depending on what sound he's trying to create. Keith's response, remembered by multiple people who were present, is that maybe Jimi should try open G tuning. That's where you really have to understand the guitar because you're working within a specific constraint that requires you to think differently about chord relationships and finger positions. Keith says that open G is his territory, that he's developed an approach to that tuning that took years to master, that it would be interesting to see if Jimi could do anything worthwhile in a tuning that Keith has made his own. It's a challenge, though not delivered directly to Jimi, more of a statement about Keith's confidence in his own specialized knowledge. This comment, like most things said in the interconnected London music scene, reaches Jimi through intermediaries. Chaz Chandler hears about it and mentions it to Jimi, framing it as Keith Richards suggesting that Jimi couldn't handle open G tuning because it requires a different kind of understanding than the flashy techniques Jimi is known for. Jimi's response is characteristically quiet and unbothered. He says he's played in various tunings, that guitar tuning is just a tool to create different sounds, that there's nothing magical about any particular tuning that makes it inherently superior or more difficult. But Chaz sees an opportunity, tells Jimi that if he could demonstrate competence in open G tuning to Keith Richards, it would earn respect from the Stones camp and from the London musicians who view Keith's rhythm playing as the gold standard for rock guitar. Jimi agrees that it might be interesting to play with Keith, to see what the Stones rhythm section is about, to learn from someone who has a completely different approach to guitar than his own. Arrangements are made through mutual friends. A small gathering is organized at a rehearsal space in West London, ostensibly just a casual jam session between musicians, nothing formal or recorded, just an opportunity for Keith and Jimi to play together and see what happens. The Stones are between projects, Keith has free time, and he's curious enough about Jimi to show up even though he's skeptical about whether the evening will be worthwhile. The gathering is intentionally kept small. Keith and Charlie Watts from the Stones, Jimi and Mitch Mitchell from The Experience, and 3 or 4 other musicians and friends, maybe 10 people total. When Keith arrives at the rehearsal space carrying his Telecaster that's permanently tuned to open G, he's in his characteristic mode of cool confidence, relaxed but alert, ready to demonstrate his territory if challenged but not particularly concerned about competition from someone whose approach to guitar is so different from his own. Jimi arrives with Chaz Chandler carrying his Stratocaster, dressed in his flamboyant style that immediately marks him as operating in a different aesthetic universe than Keith's studied rock and roll casualness. The introductions are polite, but there's an undercurrent of evaluation happening on both sides. Keith respects success, and Jimi has achieved success quickly in London, which counts for something. But Keith is also protective of his own identity as a guitarist, particularly around the open G tuning that he considers his innovation and signature. They talk for a while about guitars and equipment, the kind of technical conversation that musicians use to establish credentials and common ground. Keith shows Jimi his Telecaster, explains his 5-string open G setup, demonstrates a few characteristic riffs. Jimi listens and watches with genuine interest, asking questions about how Keith developed this approach, what made him remove the 6th string, how he thinks about chord voicings in this configuration. The questions are intelligent and show that Jimi understands guitar theory, but Keith remains confident that understanding something theoretically is very different from being able to execute it in practice. Someone suggests they should play something together, just jam on a simple progression and see how their styles interact. Keith agrees and proposes they play in open G, since that's what his guitar is tuned to, and since that was the implicit challenge anyway. He offers to tune Jimi's Stratocaster to open G if Jimi wants, so they can both work in the same configuration. Jimi accepts this offer and hands his guitar to Keith, who retunes it to open G, removing the low E string to match his own setup, explaining as he works how the tuning creates different interval relationships that require rethinking standard chord shapes and scale patterns. When Keith hands the retuned guitar back to Jimi, there's a moment where everyone in the room is waiting to see what will happen. Whether Jimi will struggle with the unfamiliar tuning, or whether he'll adapt quickly, or whether something else entirely will occur. They start playing, Keith establishing a groove in open G, a shuffle rhythm that's characteristic of his style, economical and driving, the kind of thing that sounds simple, but that actually requires precise timing and understanding of how the open strings interact with fretted notes. Charlie Watts comes in on drums, locking into Keith's rhythm, and suddenly there's that Rolling Stones pocket, that groove that's their signature. Jimi comes in on rhythm too, playing supportive chords, listening to what Keith is doing, clearly figuring out how the tuning works, how the strings relate to each other in this configuration. For the first few minutes, it's Keith's show, his rhythm defining the music, Jimi following and supporting. Keith is clearly in his element, playing with the confidence of someone who owns this territory completely. The other people in the room are nodding along, appreciating Keith's mastery, waiting to see if Jimi can contribute anything beyond competent rhythm support in this tuning that's foreign to him. Then Jimi starts to experiment. He begins adding little fills between Keith's rhythm patterns, not trying to take over but finding spaces where additional guitar lines can fit. At first, these fills are simple, just basic note patterns that demonstrate Jimi is understanding how open G works, how the tuning makes certain runs easier and other runs harder compared to standard tuning. Keith notices and nods approval, respecting that Jimi is picking up the tuning quickly enough to play coherently. But then Jimi starts to push further, starts to incorporate techniques that Keith has never heard in open G tuning, starts to bend strings in ways that create intervals that shouldn't be possible with the open tuning structure, starts to use the open strings themselves as drones while playing melodic lines on the fretted strings, creating a layered sound that makes one guitar sound like two guitars playing complementary parts. Keith's expression changes from relaxed confidence to focused attention. He's hearing things in open G tuning that he didn't know were possible, techniques that he never considered because he's been working within certain assumptions about what the tuning can do. Jimi is playing with the tuning rather than within it, treating the open G configuration not as a constraint that requires specific techniques, but as a new set of possibilities that can be explored and exploited in ways Keith never attempted. The other musicians in the room are leaning forward, watching Jimi's hands, trying to understand how he's creating these sounds with a tuning he just learned minutes ago. Charlie Watts, who normally maintains a poker face while playing, is watching Jimi with visible amazement, his drumming continuing on autopilot while his attention is captured by what's happening with the guitars. Then Jimi does something that Keith later described as the moment he realized he was watching something beyond normal musical learning. Jimi takes one of Keith's characteristic open G riffs, the kind of rhythm pattern that defines the Stones' sound, and he plays it back but with variations and elaborations that make it sound like the riff Keith created was just a sketch, and Jimi is showing the fully realized version. He's using the exact same tuning and the same basic finger patterns that Keith uses, but he's adding hammer-ons and pull-offs in unexpected places, incorporating slides that connect chord positions in ways that create melodic movement within the rhythm, using his thumb on the low strings to create bass lines that complement the chordal patterns his fingers are playing on the high strings. It's still recognizably the riff that Keith created, but it's been expanded and deepened and made more complex in ways that don't feel like showing off, but rather feel like revealing possibilities that were always there in the tuning but that Keith never saw. Keith stops playing. His hands go still on his guitar and he just listens and watches as Jimi continues, now playing alone with Charlie's drums, exploring the open G tuning like someone who has been playing in it for years, finding new chord voicings and melodic patterns, making the 5-string configuration sound fuller and more versatile than Keith's 6-string standard tuning ever did. The other people in the room have stopped talking, stopped moving, all attention focused on what Jimi is doing. One of the musicians present later said in an interview that watching Jimi explore open G tuning was like watching someone pick up a book written in a language they don't know and immediately start reading it fluently, not just pronouncing the words, but understanding the grammar and the poetry, and being able to add their own verses that fit perfectly with the original text. Jimi plays an open G for approximately 20 minutes, moving through different feels and tempos, showing that what he's doing isn't just one trick or technique that happens to work, but rather a complete understanding of how the tuning functions and what it makes possible. He plays rhythm patterns that could be Stones songs, but he also plays melodic solos that use the open strings as constant tones underneath moving fretted notes, creating a sound that's almost sitar-like in its combination of drone and melody. He plays slide guitar without a slide, using his fingers to create smooth transitions between notes that approximate the sound of glass or metal on strings. He plays percussive rhythms by hitting the body of the guitar while maintaining chord patterns with his fretting hand, creating beats and tones simultaneously. Every technique he demonstrates is enhanced by the open G tuning, showing that the tuning isn't just one approach to guitar, but rather a whole universe of possibilities that Keith has explored only partially, despite years of dedicated focus. When Jimi finally stops playing and looks up, the room is silent. Keith Richards is sitting with his guitar in his lap, not playing, his expression showing something that multiple witnesses described as confusion mixed with respect, mixed with something like sadness. Charlie Watts breaks the silence by laughing, not mockery but genuine amazed laughter, saying something like, "Well, that's us finished then, isn't it?" Keith doesn't laugh. He looks at his guitar, looks at Jimi's guitar, which is tuned identically to his own, looks back at Jimi, and says something that everyone present remembered clearly. He says, "I've been playing in this tuning for 5 years and you just showed me things I never knew existed." It's an admission that cost Keith something to make, a public acknowledgement that what he thought was his mastery was actually just familiarity, that there were levels to this tuning that he never reached because he never thought to look for them. Jimi's response is characteristically humble. He says that Keith's playing in open G is what made the tuning interesting to him, that hearing Keith's riffs over the years showed possibilities that made Jimi want to explore what else the tuning could do. He says that Keith created a language in open G and that Jimi was just speaking that language with a different accent, that the foundation Keith built is what made it possible for Jimi to experiment so quickly. It's a generous response that acknowledges Keith's innovation while explaining Jimi's rapid mastery. But it doesn't really address the fundamental question that everyone in the room is thinking. How did Jimi learn a new tuning in minutes and immediately start playing it at a level that Keith never achieved in years? One of the musicians present later said that the only explanation that made sense was that Jimi's understanding of guitar was so deep and intuitive that tunings were just different dialects of the same language, that what took normal players years to learn took Jimi minutes, because he wasn't learning techniques. He was recognizing patterns that existed in all configurations of the instrument. They play together for another hour after that initial demonstration, Keith and Jimi trading leads and rhythms, both still in open G, Keith now trying to incorporate ideas he heard from Jimi, while Jimi continues to explore the tuning's possibilities. The dynamic has shifted completely. At the start of the session, Keith was the master demonstrating his territory. Now Keith is the student trying to understand what Jimi just taught him about a tuning Keith thought he owned. Charlie Watts later said in an interview that watching Keith that evening was fascinating because Keith is not someone who shows vulnerability or doubt easily, but his reaction to Jimi's playing was nakedly honest, showing that he was genuinely surprised and genuinely humbled by what he heard. The other musicians present described a similar response, saying that Keith didn't get defensive or competitive but rather curious and excited, like someone who just discovered that a room he'd been living in for years had a door he never noticed that led to an entire wing of the house he didn't know existed. When the session ends and people are packing up their instruments, Keith pulls Jimi aside for a private conversation. The people who witnessed this conversation from a distance said they couldn't hear what was said, but that Keith's body language showed intensity and engagement, that he was asking questions and listening carefully to answers, that whatever he and Jimi were discussing mattered deeply to Keith. Jimi later told Chaz Chandler that Keith had asked him about his approach to learning guitar, about whether he practiced specific techniques or just played intuitively, about how he thought about the relationship between tunings and sounds. Jimi said that he tried to explain that for him, guitar wasn't about mastering specific techniques, but about listening to the sounds in his head and finding ways to make the guitar produce those sounds, that tunings and techniques were just tools to achieve particular effects, that he didn't think of himself as particularly innovative, but just as someone trying to match what he heard internally with what came out of the instrument. In the days and weeks following this session, Keith Richards talked about it extensively with other musicians and in interviews. His description of what happened remained remarkably consistent. He said that watching Jimi play an open G was the most educational and humbling experience of his guitar playing life. He said that he had built his entire identity around this tuning, had thought of it as his territory and his innovation, and that Jimi had shown him in minutes that what he thought was mastery was just scratching the surface. Keith said that the experience didn't make him want to give up guitar or change his approach fundamentally, but it did make him realize that there were dimensions to music and to instruments that some people could access and that he probably never would. That genius operated on a level that was different in kind, rather than just different in degree from normal talented playing. The impact of this session on Keith's playing is debatable. Some musicians who knew him well said that after meeting Jimi, Keith's approach to open G became more adventurous, that he tried to incorporate more melodic playing and more complex voicings, that he became less satisfied with the economical rhythm approach that had been his signature. Others said that Keith remained fundamentally the same player, that the encounter with Jimi confirmed Keith's belief that his role in the Stones was specific and important even if it wasn't flashy, that being the rhythm foundation was its own form of mastery even if it wasn't the same as Jimi's exploratory genius. What's undeniable is that Keith spoke about Jimi with genuine reverence for the rest of his life, that when Jimi died in 1970, Keith was genuinely devastated by the loss of someone he considered not just a peer, but a teacher, who had shown him that music contained more possibilities than Keith had imagined. The other people who were present at that autumn session in 1967 all tell stories that are remarkably consistent in their core details. They all remember Keith's challenge about open G tuning, remember Jimi accepting the challenge by allowing his guitar to be retuned, remember Jimi's rapid mastery of the unfamiliar configuration, remember Keith's visible reaction shifting from confidence to amazement to something like grief, as he recognized that what he thought was his territory had been explored more deeply in 20 minutes by someone encountering it for the first time than Keith had explored it in years. They all remember the atmosphere in the room changing, the sense that they were witnessing not just impressive guitar playing, but something that revealed truths about talent and genius and the difference between mastery and transcendence. Jimi Hendrix never spoke publicly about the session with Keith Richards, never used it for promotional purposes, never claimed to have outplayed Keith or proven anything. This discretion was typical of Jimi's personality, his reluctance to engage in the competitive posturing that characterized much of the rock scene. When asked about Keith in interviews, Jimi spoke with respect about the Stones' rhythm section and Keith's role in creating their sound, acknowledging that Keith's approach to open G had influenced countless guitarists and had created a style that was immediately recognizable and widely copied. The fact that Jimi could master that style in minutes and expand it in ways Keith never achieved was treated by Jimi as unremarkable, just another evening of playing music with other musicians, not a competition or a conquest, but a collaboration and exploration. The story of Keith Richards challenging Jimi Hendrix to play an open G tuning has circulated among guitarists for decades, often embellished with details that don't match witness testimony, sometimes exaggerated into explicit competition rather than the more complex encounter that actually occurred. But the fundamental truth remains consistent across all reliable accounts. Keith Richards, master of open G tuning and creator of some of rock's most recognizable riffs based on that tuning, watched Jimi Hendrix pick up the tuning in minutes and demonstrate possibilities that Keith never discovered in years, and this experience humbled Keith in ways that changed his understanding of what guitar mastery means. It wasn't about Jimi being better at what Keith does, but rather about Jimi revealing that what Keith does exists within a larger universe of possibility that Keith had only partially explored. That expertise in one approach doesn't mean comprehensive understanding of the instrument, that there are always deeper levels of knowledge and capability that genius can access while the rest of us work within comfortable constraints. When you listen to Keith Richards playing after 1967, you can hear moments where he's trying to incorporate ideas that emerged from that session with Jimi, places where his rhythm playing becomes more melodic or more complex, attempts to push beyond the economical foundation that's his signature towards something more expansive. Whether these attempts succeed is subjective, but the fact that Keith continued trying, continued pushing his own boundaries even within the constraints of the Stones' music, shows that the encounter with Jimi left a lasting impact. And when you listen to Jimi Hendrix's music, knowing that he could master a specialized tuning in minutes and expand it beyond what its creator achieved in years, you understand that what Jimi was doing transcended normal categories of guitar playing, that he was operating on a level where instruments became extensions of musical thought rather than objects requiring technical mastery, where sounds existed fully formed in his mind and the challenge was just finding the physical means to manifest them.